Hi, and welcome to our class on Heaven, Hell, and Purgatory in C.S. Lewis. The great medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, quote, "In the end, language can only be related to what is experienced here. And given that the hereafter is not here, we can only infer." In these words, Aquinas was taking up some of the most basic human questions that have existed since the beginning of time. Is there life after death? If so, what's the nature of it? Does it include heaven? Where is heaven? How do we get to heaven? If humans are in fact constrained by language, as Aquinas suggests, that has not restricted the outpouring of theological, philosophical, literary, and artistic representations of heaven throughout the centuries. In short, we're fascinated by the concept of heaven, no less so by the concepts of hell and, to a lesser extent perhaps, purgatory. In the Old Testament, heaven appears in the book of Genesis, right at the beginning of the story of creation. And it continues to appear all the way through both the Old and New Testaments, though unfortunately not in as much detail as we would like. Conceptions of heaven have differed, often considerably, throughout history, and even throughout Christian history. Tertullian, for example, argued that a kingdom is promised to us on earth, before heaven, after the resurrection, and for 1,000 years in the divinely built city of Jerusalem, which had been let down from heaven. In the Middle Ages, we often find an emphasis on Christian believers ascending a ladder to heaven. Dante famously divided heaven into 10 sections. In the 17th century, the English Puritan writer John Bunyan, in his Visions of Heaven and Hell, provided a detailed account of the afterlife that continues to influence Christians to this day. And not long ago, the English New Testament writer Tom Wright startled many evangelicals by arguing that heaven was not a place far away where God dwells, and to which Christians will one day ascend, but a redeemed earth. And if we're tempted to think that the theology of life after death is easy, think again. When I was a seminary student, I took a class from Glenn Barker, the provost here at Fuller. During the academic term, his wife died. As I had come to know him a little, I asked him, after a suitable time and at an appropriate moment, I asked him how he was doing. His response surprised me. "I'm okay," he said, "but I wonder a lot about my wife. Where is she right now?" It's that idea of the in-between or the intermediary state that I can't get my mind around. Well, I thought, if someone like Glenn Barker, a brilliant theologian and biblical scholar, can't figure it out, how can I? There are at least 5 reasons why heaven, hell, and purgatory are important to our study of C.S. Lewis. First of all, hell and heaven were real, that is, literal, to Lewis, and references to them appear extensively throughout his writings. In particular, in the chapters Hell and Heaven in the Problem of Pain, throughout the Screwtape Letters, in The Great Divorce, and in his essay Transposition. Secondly, the doctrine of purgatory. Lewis may have believed in purgatory of a certain kind. This was revealed principally in his Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, one of the last books that he wrote and published the year after he died. Number 3, contemporary Christian thinking. As suggested earlier, Christian thinking on heaven and hell is often muddled and confused. This is primarily the result of, 1, modernist denial of the reality of hell, or even the idea of an afterlife. 2, Scripture's lack of clarity about what happens to believers at the point of death, or during the so-called intermediary stage, as Glenn Barker called it. For example, do we, body and soul, go directly to heaven at the moment of death? Or do both, our body and soul, sleep in the ground until Jesus' second coming? Or does just our soul go directly to heaven at the time of death, while our body rests or sleeps in the ground until the time of Jesus' second coming? Or perhaps annihilasm. In other words, we die, we just cease to exist. Or are there other possibilities? Finally, at the time of death, are Christians completely prepared spiritually, that is, sufficiently sanctified to enter God's presence? This is a theme that we'll take up a little bit later in the same class. Number 4, the death of his loved ones. These included his mother, his wife, and various friends, especially Charles Williams, not to mention the friends, very close friends, that died right alongside Lewis in the First World War. Each of these deaths provided greater personal motivation for Lewis's exploration of the themes of heaven, hell, and purgatory. And finally, number 5, scholarly interest. Lewis's scholarly interest focused on a period of literary prose and poetry, that is, the 14th through the 17th centuries, that was especially rich on the subject. It produced 2 of the greatest writers on the subject, Dante and John Milton, and 2 of the greatest examples of imaginative realizations of heaven and hell ever written, Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. Lewis first read Paradise Lost at the age of 9. In 1942, he published a major scholarly work on the subject entitled A Preface to Paradise Lost. Dante's Divine Comedy received even greater praise. As Lewis wrote, Dante remains a strong candidate for the supreme poetical honors of the world. Moreover, he adds, and here he's concurring with the earlier views expressed by T.S. Eliot, moreover, the last canto of the Paradios is the highest point that poetry has ever reached. Lewis wrote extensively about heaven, portraying it in 3 distinct but complementary ways. First, imaginatively. Lewis attempts to illustrate heaven imaginatively, not literally. Why? Heaven is simply far too great, he concluded, far too wonderful to portray. As he asked, if we could envision heaven, would we really want to go there? Secondly, as unfallen worlds. Lewis provides us with a number of varying accounts of earthly paradises, unfallen worlds, you might like to call them, like Malacandra and Paralandra, and especially Narnia before its corruption by the White Witch, at a time in which the primary harmony between God, humanity, and the created order remained unspoiled. These unfallen worlds provide a bridge for the reader's imagination, which is a crucial literary tool for Lewis, a bridge between the happiness suggested by creation on earth and that to come in the heavenly existence. And then thirdly, Lewis portrays heaven as a reasonable hope and our deepest desire. In his Christian apologetics, he portrays heaven as both a reasonable hope and the deepest desire of the human heart. It is nothing less than ultimate or deep reality itself. In Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces, which he considered his best book, we have a powerful and moving, imaginative treatment of heaven as seen through the death of Psyche. Things in the land of Glome have been unwell for some time. A series of disasters has plagued the king and the local population, who are now becoming restless. Ungat, the local deity, is angry and will only be satisfied if the great offering is made. But what is the great offering? Ungat's priest demands that the king hand over the accused, his youngest daughter, Psyche. who, according to tradition, is to be taken up to the mountain and bound to the holy tree, where she will be ravished by the mythical creature known as the Brute. Instead, Psyche is rescued by Ilium, a winged god, the son of Ungut, and the most beautiful of the gods, who takes Psyche away to his secret palace, where she becomes his wife. Psyche later described to her sister what happened to her on that day as she lay chained to the holy tree. First, she described imaginatively her human death. And he took me in his beautiful arms, which seemed to burn me, though the burning didn't hurt, and pulled me right out of the iron girdle. And that didn't hurt either, and I don't know how he did it. And carried me up into the air, far above the ground, and whirled me away. Of course, he was invisible again almost at once. I had seen him only as one sees a lightning flash, but that didn't matter. Now I knew it was he. I wasn't in the least afraid of sailing along in the sky, even of turning head over heels in it. Then she described her new, transformed life in heaven, again imaginatively. Lewis writes, "So he carried me through the air and set me down softly. At first I was all out of breath and too bewildered to see where I was. But when I came to myself, you can think what a moment that was, and saw the house before me. I was lying at the threshold. And it wasn't, you see, just the gold and amber house I used to imagine. If it had been just that, I might indeed have thought I was dreaming. But I saw it wasn't, and not quite like any house in this land. Something new, never conceived of. You could see that it was a God's house at once. I don't mean a temple where God is worshipped, a God's house where he lives. I would not for any wealth have gone into it, but I had to, for there came a voice, sweet, oh, sweeter than any music, yet my hair rose at it too. And do you know what it said? It said, 'Enter your house.' Yes, it called it my house. Psyche, the bride of the god." I went, cold, small, and shaking, up the steps and through the porch and into the courtyard. There was no one to be seen. But then the voices came, all around me, bidding me welcome. "What kind of voices?" her sister asked. "Like women's voices. And they said, 'Enter, lady, enter, mistress. Do not be afraid.' And they were moving as the speakers moved, though I could see no one, and leading me by their movements. And so they brought me into a cool parlor with an arched roof, where there was a table set out with fruit and wine, such fruits as never seen. They said, 'Refresh yourself, lady, before the bath. After it comes the feast.' They gave me fruit. They gave me wine. The spirits gave them to me. I couldn't see their hands. Yet it never looked as if the plates or the cup were moving of themselves. You could see the hands were doing it. And when I took the cup, I felt the other hands touching my own. Again that burning, though without pain. Then they had me to the bath. It is the most delicate pillared court, open to the sky, and the water is like crystal and smells as sweet as this whole valley. And then they dressed me again in the most beautiful things. And then came the banquet and the music. And then they had me to bed. And the night came. And then he. the bridegroom, the God himself. In The Great Divorce, Lewis's readers are presented with another and very different imaginative treatment of heaven. In order to illustrate the nature of heaven and explain why people exclude themselves from it, Lewis introduces the medieval concept of a refrigerum. That is, those who are in hell are allowed, if they wish, a one-day visit to heaven. Lewis was first introduced to the idea of a refrigerum around August of 1931, while reading a sermon of the 17th century Anglican divine Jeremy Taylor, entitled Christ Advent to Judgment. This doctrine of a refrigerum, Taylor argued, can be found in an early 17th century French Roman Catholic missal, though its source can be traced back to the 4th century Latin poet and hymn writer Prudentius Aurelius Clemens. Now this is what a refrigerum involves, at least in Lewis's interpretation. A group of ghosts are taken by bus to the outer precincts of heaven for a visit. When their bus arrives, each ghost is invited to tour heaven, or at least to the outer precincts, one by one, accompanied by his or her own individual guide. However, the ghosts are so unaccustomed to heaven's delicate atmosphere that the soft grass feels like iron spikes on their bare feet, while the raindrops will tear them to pieces. During their guided tour, each ghost is asked if they would like to remain. Surprisingly, few decide to stay. But why, everybody asks? Wouldn't everybody want to be in heaven? Each ghost offers a different reason, though they each share one thing in common. They all insist on having things their way and not God's way. They prefer hell because they desire something less than true reality. Consequently, employing their free will, they return to hell. If only they would forget themselves, as one in the story does, they will in time grow stronger and more solid and real. But few can do so. As with Dante, in Lewis, choice is the key element. God allows free will, complete and utter freedom. But since we are outside time, as we know it, choice acts retrospectively. That is, it acts backwards as well as forwards, so that events in the past become good or bad, pleasurable or painful, according to the choices they lead to. One ghost, for example, is shocked to meet a former employee at heaven, a young man who had murdered another man. Now both he, who is of course repentant and forgiven, and his victim reside happily together in paradise. The ghost who's visiting from hell can't believe his eyes. Their exchange is most revealing. The ghost asks, "What I'd like to understand is what you're here for, as pleased as Punch. You, a bloody murderer, while I've been walking the streets down there and living in a place like a pigsty all these years." The angel answers, "That is a little hard to understand at first, but it is all over now. You will be pleased about it presently. Till then, there is no need to bother about it." No need to bother about it? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? No, not as you mean. I do not look at myself. I have given up myself. I had to, you know, after the murder. That is what it did for me. And that is how everything began. Personally, I'd have thought you and I ought to be the other way around. That's my personal opinion. Very likely we soon shall be, if you'll stop thinking about it. To which the ghost replies, "Look at me now. I gone straight all my life. I don't say I was a religious man, and I don't say I had no faults. Far from it. But I done my best in life, see? I done my best by everyone. That's the sort of chap I was. I never asked for anything that wasn't mine by rights. And if I wanted a drink, I paid for it. And if I took my wages, I done my job, see? I only want my rights. I'm not asking for anybody's bleeding charity." "Then do, at once," pleads the angel. "Ask for the bleeding charity. Everything is here for the asking, and nothing can be bought." Well, all that's just too much for the ghost, and he concludes, "Tell them I'm not coming. See? I'd rather be damned than go along with you. I came here to get my rights, see? Not to go sniveling along on charity tied onto your apron strings. I didn't come here to be treated like a dog. Damn and blast the whole pack of you." Another ghost, a modernist bishop from the Church of England, responds similarly. While alive, the bishop had denied the reality of heaven and hell and demythologized all of Christianity, stripping it of all its supernaturalism. He had never really thought seriously about these points, but he knew that advancing them would bring popularity, increased book sales, and advancement in the church. He was soon appointed a bishop. These views allowed him to become the opponent of fundamentalists, or those who preach salvation by grace through faith. After some lengthy semantical sparring with his angel host, the bishop rejects the invitation to remain in heaven. Why? Well, he wants no part of repentance. He insists on being useful, but his usefulness is not needed in heaven. He also insists on being assured that heaven is a place of free intellectual inquiry. He finds, however, that heaven is not a place of questions, but of answers. He also insists on the need for religious pursuit, but he finds that there is no religion in heaven, only Christ. Finally, the bishop concludes that he cannot possibly remain in heaven because he has to get back in hell next Friday to read a paper at the Theological Society there. His paper will argue that as Jesus was comparatively young when he was crucified, he would have outgrown some of his earlier and more extreme views had he in fact lived. The presentation of such a creative and original concept simply cannot be put off, and so he gets back on the bus. We then meet a succession of ghosts. Some insist on explaining hell to the angels, as if they could extend hell and bring it bodily into heaven. Others, who are Gnostics, want to transform heaven by damming the river, cutting down the trees, killing all the animals, and covering it entirely with asphalt. Still others, who are probably Freudians, try to convince the angels that they've been deluded. There is no life after death, and this whole place is only a hallucination. Another ghost that we meet was a famous artist back on Earth. While he was young, light itself was his first love. He only loved painting as a means of telling others about light. But as he grew older and more respectable, he became interested in painting for its own sake. The dialogue unfolds like this. "Will I meet anyone famous in heaven?" the ghost asked. "Perhaps Claude Monet or Cézanne?" "Sooner or later," came the reply from the angel, "if they're here. But surely in the case of distinguished people, you'd hear." "But they aren't distinguished. came the reply. No more than anyone else. The glory flows into everyone and back from everyone, like light and mirrors. But the light's the thing. He comes to learn that in heaven, everyone is famous. Moreover, he learns that on earth he has now been entirely forgotten, his work out of fashion. He's so startled by this pronouncement that he declares, I must be off at once. Let me go. Damn it all, one has one's duty to the future of art. I must go back to my friends. I must write an article. There must be a manifesto. We must start a periodical. We must have publicity. Let me go. This is beyond a joke. Yet another ghost was a fashionable and ambitious woman. This woman, while alive, had driven her easygoing husband to a nervous breakdown and an early death. After having the tour of the outer precincts of heaven, she concludes that she'd be willing to remain, but only if she's given a free hand to take charge of her husband. As we read, with all the time one would have here, I believe I could make something of him. I was only beginning. There's lots of things I still want to do with him. Give him back to me. Why should he have everything his own way? It's no good for him. It isn't right. It's not fair. Suddenly, after towering up like a dying candle flame, the ghost snapped. A sour, dry smell lingered in the air for a moment, and then she was gone. The story reminded me of this cartoon from the New Yorker, where one ghost says to the other, actually, I was assigned to heaven, but it would have meant spending eternity with my first wife. In fact, only one of the ghosts on the entire bus remains in heaven. This ghost carried a little red lizard representing lust on his shoulder, and he was constantly trying to stop it from whispering things in his ear. Would you like me to make him quiet? Asked the angel host. Of course, replied the ghost. Then I will kill him, he said, taking a step forward. But this was more than the ghost wanted. You didn't say anything about killing him. I hardly meant to bother you with anything so drastic as that. It's the only way, replied the angel. Shall I kill it? After much deliberation, the angel repeatedly asking for permission to kill the lizard, and the lizard pleading with the ghost to let it alone, the ghost reluctantly consents. Damn and blast you! Go on, can't you? Get it over with. Do what you like. God help me. God help him. The ghost screamed as the angel grabbed the lizard and broke its back before flinging it to the ground. The ghost was left shaken and reeling, but he quickly recovered and soon began to assume the appearance of an angel. Even the lizard was transformed into a glorious stallion. The ghost, now transformed, then rode off on the horse to the high country of heaven. Perhaps it's not surprising that most of the visitors remained self-deceived, firmly attached to hell, or to earth and its attractions. In an insightful comment, Lewis warns us of this danger. He writes, if we insist on keeping hell, or even earth, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell. Any man who reaches heaven will find that what he abandoned, even in plucking out his right eye, was precisely nothing. That the kernel of what he was really seeking, even in his most depraved wishes, will be there beyond expectation, waiting for him in the high countries. I think earth, if chosen instead of heaven, will turn out to have been all along only a region of hell. and earth, if put second to heaven, to have been from the beginning a part of heaven itself. But all this raises an important question. Why is it that most of the goats reject the offer of heaven? The short answer is they would have to give up too much that they loved and held dear to their hearts. Broadly defined, this included themselves, their individuality, and their personal autonomy. In each case that Lewis presents, there is some specific compulsion or attitude that each ghost insists on retaining that locks him or her into their present existence in hell, including respectability, or intellectual snobbery, or reputation, or control. Though these impulses are fairly innocent in themselves, each can become an idol that keeps men and women from accepting God's offer of heaven. As Lewis reminds us, any natural impulse, no matter how virtuous, can become destructive or become perverted if it is regarded as the sole absolute. The most common impulse that excludes the soul from heaven, or keeps the soul in hell, is, of course, pride. It is perhaps the most deadly of the various sins because it locks us into an attitude in which, for various reasons, we refuse God's free gift of heaven and its joyful reality. This raises another important question. Will all people eventually be saved? That is, universalism? This is an issue that Lewis pondered for many years. We can see his writing on it in The Problem of Pain. Lewis replies here that we don't know. But two things are certain. We are all eternal, and we all have free will. Thus, we will all live forever, and we will all be able or be allowed to choose our own eternal destiny. We all make choices, though any single choice may seem insignificant at the time. The consequences of our choices add up over the years. Each choice changes us, if only a little. The cumulative effects of these choices are, however, significant. Sanctification leads us to God. Remaining independent or autonomous, that is, abusing our free will, leads us further and further from God. As each individual is destined for everlasting life of some kind, each moment of our life is a preparation for that experience. While there are innumerable roads in the world, they all lead, eventually, to either heaven or hell. Finally, when we reach either heaven or hell, we will not be surprised, for our preparation for it will have begun many years earlier. Heaven or hell, Lewis tells us, will thus feel quite natural when we arrive, despite heaven being real or deep reality. Lewis also wrote extensively on the subject of heaven in a number of his other books, essays, and poems. In The Last Battle, for example, in one of the most moving passages that Lewis ever wrote, Aslan explains the meaning of the deep heaven, or deep reality, to the four children. We read, "There was a real railway accident," said Aslan softly. "Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning." And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I can hardly write them. And as for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story, All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. We also find throughout C.S. Lewis's writings many allusions to hell. In his poetry, for example, most significantly in his poem The Queen of Drum, or in his essays, where especially the essays The Trouble with X and In God in the Dock, and Screwtape Proposes a Toast, or in his books, most significantly in The Pilgrim's Regress, The Problem with Pain, The Screwtape Letters, and The Great Divorce. What did Lewis understand hell to be? What kind of place? He provides at least 4 different possibilities. First of all, separation from God, quite simply. Secondly, a state of mind. He writes in The Great Divorce, "Hell is a state of mind, and every state of mind, left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeon of its own mind, is, in the end, hell." Thirdly, self-determined, or a human choice. As Lewis writes, it is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us there is something growing up, that is, original sin, which will of itself be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. Elsewhere, Lewis writes, the choice of every lost soul can be expressed in the words, "Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." There is always something they insist on keeping, even at the price of misery. There is always something they prefer to joy, that is, to reality. In other words, the lost are self-deceived. Thus, we are not sent to hell. We go there because we choose it. Finally, number 4, hell is complex, naughty, and ambiguous in theory, as is all Christian theology. In 2 of Lewis's works, we find 2 distinct but complementary versions of hell, the Screwtape Letters and the Great Divorce. For those who have not read the book, perhaps a brief explanation would be helpful. Screwtape is a series of letters from a senior devil, named, appropriate enough, Screwtape, to a junior devil named Wormwood, his young and inexperienced nephew. The book is often hilarious, dark, and sinister. Most especially, it provides great insight into temptation, as it's viewed from the other side. Lewis wrote the book in 1940, at one of the darkest moments in Britain's long history. The Nazis had, by this time, overrun the continent of Europe. The British army had been defeated and evacuated in humility off the beaches at Dunkirk. The Blitz was about to commence, threatening to obliterate the cities, the population, the architectural treasures, and the industrial might of Britain. The situation was summed up by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On June 18, 1940, just after Germany had overrun Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France, Churchill made one of the most famous speeches of the entire 20th century to the House of Parliament. Britain now stood alone, as he informed the Commons. The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions, and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. It was a moment when the continuation of all that Lewis cared for and all that he loved deeply was under the threat of annihilation. It was also one of Britain's finest hours. A month later, on the evening of July 19th, Lewis listened to a speech of Adolf Hitler over the wireless. They could get all of the speeches of the Fuhrer in England because the close proximity of the continent to England. And many people in England did listen to him, and Lewis had enough German to be able to understand exactly what Hitler was saying. Like Churchill, Lewis understood perfectly that Hitler and National Socialism were thoroughly evil. To say the least, both men were insightful of human nature, and neither suffered fools gladly. Hence, there were no doubts, no confusion about the diabolical ambitions of Hitler for world control and domination, or over the nature of what Britain faced. In light of that, Lewis was both shocked and disturbed to find that while Hitler's speech lasted, quote, it was impossible not to waver just a little. It wasn't just a matter of what Hitler said, it was more the way that he said it, full of absolute confidence and certitude. On reflection, Lewis was alarmed that he had almost been persuaded by the Fuhrer's performance. These events percolated in Lewis's mind. 2 days later, a Sunday, while at church, and in the midst of a very boring sermon, an idea for a new book came to Lewis. The book became the Screwtape Letters. As he wrote to his brother later that same day, the idea of the book would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. Of all Lewis's many writings, it was Screwtape that first established his fame as an author throughout the world. Lewis would later reveal one of his reasons for writing Screwtape. He wrote, its purpose was not to speculate about diabolical life, but to throw light from a new angle on the life of men. Elsewhere, Lewis offered another reason for writing the book. He wrote, there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race, that is the human race, can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors, and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. But what did Lewis mean by devils? He defined this in the second preface to Screwtape, where he writes, now if by the devil you mean a powerful opposite to God, and, like God, self-existent from all eternity, the answer is certainly no. There is no uncreated being except God. God has no opposite. no being could attain a perfect badness opposite to the perfect goodness of God. For when you have taken away every kind of good thing, intelligence, will, memory, energy, and existence itself, there would be none of him left. The proper question is whether I believe in devils. I do. That is to say, I believe in angels, and I believe that some of these, by the abuse of their free will, have become enemies of God, and as a corollary, to us. These we may call devils. They do not differ in nature from good angels, but their nature is depraved. Devil is the opposite of angel, only as bad man is the opposite of good man. Satan, the leader or dictator of devils, is the opposite not of God, but of Michael. Lewis also tried to provide a picture of his understanding of the nature of hell. It's not a place of fire and brimstone. It is instead well-lighted and meticulously managed place, a place of order. It's not a place of punishment, but the nightmare of bureaucracy, of which the worst police state is but a pale comparison. As he wrote, we must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. I live in the managerial age, in a world of admin, short for administration. The greatest evil is now not done in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It's not done even in concentration camps and labor camps. Hell, he concludes, is conceived and ordered in clean, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. Hence, naturally enough, my symbol for hell is something like the bureaucracy of a police state or the offices of a thoroughly nasty business concern. Now, some students over the years have pondered this and have wondered where this comes from, and I'd like to suggest that this arises from Lewis's own experience of living in Magdalen College, Oxford, for 25 years as a tutorial fellow. These colleges, particularly in those days, were really small places, maybe a fellowship of about 25 men, all living together, eating together, 2-3 meals a day, all sitting on committees together and governing bodies and so forth, and all probably pretty frustrated by their lack of advancement and lack of ambition for getting ahead in the world, or opportunities for getting ahead. By all accounts, Magdalen was a pretty grim place, bureaucratic, filled with rivalries and resentments. And we can easily imagine, I think, that Lewis painted this picture of hell as a depiction of the 25 years that he spent in a place very much like this in Oxford. Each letter from Screwtape to Wormwood addresses a different way in which humans can be diverted from their divine purpose. For example, the use of argument or reasoning must be strictly avoided. Given the effects of the media and other modern influences, jargon is a much safer and more effective alternative. Secondly, the church militant must remain invisible to the patient. Instead, get him to focus on the hypocrisy of his fellow churchgoers, on bad liturgy and even worse hymns, and on the ineffectiveness and incompetence of the local pastor in his sermon. Third, help the patient avoid prayer whenever possible. When he does pray, encourage him to remember the parrot-like nature of his prayers in childhood. Number 5, also get him into a vaguely devotional mood in which real concentration of will and intelligence have no part. Finally, if that fails, Get him to turn his gaze away from God and towards himself. Keep him watching his own mind and trying to produce feelings there by the action of his own will. When he means to ask God for charity, let him instead start trying to manufacture charitable feelings for himself and not notice what he is doing. When he means to pray for courage, let him really try to feel brave. When he is praying for forgiveness, let him try to feel forgiven. Teach him to estimate the value of each prayer by his success in producing the desired feeling, and never let him suspect how much success or failure of that kind depends on whether he is well or ill, fresh or tired at the moment of praying. But all this is to no avail. The patient eventually becomes a Christian. Wormwood has failed in his first important assignment. But Screwtape advises his protege not to worry too much. Time is on their side, after all. As he writes, the long, dull, monotonous years of middle-age prosperity or middle-age adversity are hell's best campaigning weather. It is so hard for these creatures to persevere. The routine of adversity, the gradual decay of youthful loves and youthful hopes, the quiet despair, all this proves admirable opportunities of wearing out a soul by attrition. If, on the other hand, the middle years prove prosperous, our position is even stronger. Prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. His increasing reputation, his widening circle of acquaintances, his sense of importance, the growing pressure of absorbing and agreeable work, build him up in a sense of being really at home in earth, which is just what we want. You will notice that the young are generally less unwilling to die than the middle-aged and the old. We now turn to Lewis's depiction of hell in The Great Divorce. Here, the wages of sin and selfishness are a diminished self. Lewis's version of hell, where the punishment is more of oneself and lots of exposure to other people, is nothing short of haunting. In a moment of imaginative genius, Lewis creates a hell that resembles a drab and unimaginably large urban sprawl. The ghosts who live here are not tortured in any obvious manner. Instead, they are forced to live with themselves and their eternally quarrelsome neighbors. Of course, everyone is constantly feuding. No one is happy. Consequently, the ghosts decide to solve their endless bickering by up and moving to another house on the edge of the city. For a short time, they are now relatively alone and relatively peaceful. But then other ghosts begin to arrive in the neighborhood. Of course, quarrels quickly break out, and the ghosts are back to square one. They are plunged once again into misery and can't go on living like this. So it's time to move yet again, a little further out to the new edge of the city, which is now, of course, miles away. This endlessly repeated scenario proves far worse than being tormented by devils. But how do people get to hell? In another insightful passage, Lewis explains how easy it is for us to slip into hell unawares. We might, for example, think of his long relationship with Mrs. Moore as providing a powerful example of this. He writes, "The whole difficulty of understanding hell is that the thing to be understood is so nearly nothing. It begins with a grumbling mood, and you yourself still distinct from it, perhaps even criticizing it, and yourself, in a dark hour, may will that mood, embrace it. You can repent and come out of it again, but there may come a day when you can do that no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood, nor even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. Thus we slip into hell without recognizing it through a series of decisions, actions, and attitudes, large and small. Lewis then appears in the narrative in this interesting conversation with George MacDonald, who he introduces into the book. Now recall Lewis's early illustration to Hamlet and Shakespeare, that Hamlet could have known Shakespeare if Shakespeare had written himself into the play. Well, here Lewis kind of writes himself into the play, into this dialogue, in the form of this dialogue with George MacDonald. Now, as Virgil served as Dante's guide in the Divine Comedy, so George MacDonald serves as Lewis's guide in the pages of The Great Divorce. The instruction proceeds as follows. Lewis asks, "Is judgment not final? Is there really a way out of hell into heaven?" To which MacDonald replies, "It depends on the way you're using the words. If they leave that great town behind, it will not have been hell. To any that leaves it, it is purgatory, and perhaps ye better not call this country heaven. Not deep heaven, ye understand." Here he smiled at me. "You can call it the valley of the shadow of life, and yet to those who stay here it will have been heaven from first. And ye can call those sad streets in the town yonder," referring to hell, "the valley of the shadow of death. But to those who remain there, they will have been in hell, even from the beginning." I suppose he saw that I looked puzzled, for presently he spoke again. "Son," he said, "ye cannot in your present state understand eternity." When Anidos looked through the door of the timeless, he brought no message back. But ye can get some likeness of it if ye say that both good and evil, when they are full grown, become retrospective, not only in this valley, but in all their earthly paths, will have been heaven to those who are saved. Not only the twilight in that town, but all their life on earth too, will then be seen by the damned to have been hell. This is what mortals misunderstand. They say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. And to some sinful pleasure they say, "Let me but have this, and I'll take the consequences," little dreaming how damnation will spread back and back into their past and contaminate the pleasure of the sin. Both processes begin even before death. The good man's past begins to change so that his forgiven sins and remembered sorrows take on the quality of heaven. The bad man's past already conforms to his badness and is filled only with dreariness. And that is why, at the end of all things, when the sun rises here and the twilight turns to blackness down there, the blessed will say, "We have never lived anywhere except in heaven." And the lost, "We were always in hell." And both will speak truly. Well, this is a remarkable dialogue, and I think it provides tremendous and original insight into life here on earth and the way that eternity pervades even our present temporal existence. Now, in looking at this, to try to sum up, Lewis believed, in short, that free will, that is, whether to accept God or not, or whether to repent of one's sins, he believed that free will must exist. And if free will exists, then not all will choose to be with God. Tragically but simply. Thus, hell must exist as a place for those who reject God, for those who choose to separate themselves from God, from joy. As Lewis writes, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. Those who knew C.S. Lewis often described him as the most thoroughly converted Christian that they ever knew, with a high doctrine of the sanctity of God, a deep commitment to the process of sanctification, and a belief that the Christian life is characterized by the ideal of the pilgrim. Originating out of Lewis's view of the human condition and of our great need as Christians to move through a process of sanctification or becoming more Christ-like, Lewis introduced the possibility of purgatory. He defined purgatory as a process by which the work of redemption continues and first perhaps began to be noticeable after death. Each of the following ideas directly influenced Lewis's thinking about the doctrine of purgatory. First of all, God. Recall that one of Lewis's favorite books, as we discussed in week 2, was Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, published in 1917. Otto described God as holy, sacred, and transcendent. From this, Lewis concluded that he was no more qualified spiritually to stand in the presence of God than he would have been qualified medically to perform brain surgery. What could be done to correct this? Not education, he concluded, but sanctification. Secondly, pilgrims. Lewis also believed that Christians are pilgrims in this world. We are distinct from others, that is to say, in that we are on a pilgrimage. We are under divine direction and discipline, and thus we are people with a distinct worldview. Lewis believed that becoming a Christian naturally changes our attitudes towards everything. Thus, as a pilgrim, our life is a divine pilgrimage of sanctification, not a journey of self-fulfillment. Thirdly, sanctification. Sanctification is defined as the spiritual process by which Christians become more Christ-like. It's often overlooked by contemporary Christians, as it has been in the past. Evidence of this is seen in statistic after statistic in our society that sadly records that Christians live a lifestyle that is virtually indistinguishable from that of non-Christians. Now, evangelicals and Roman Catholics have slightly different views on the idea of sanctification. Now, by evangelical, I'm using a term rather broadly, and Roman Catholic, perhaps I'm using that term rather broadly as well. But evangelicals often, not all by any means, but many, view sanctification as a kind of instant event that happens at the moment of redemption, whereas Roman Catholics place more of an emphasis upon issues of the acquisition of merit. Now, Lewis was unsympathetic to the idea, which is this idea that's advanced by some evangelicals, that everything required of a believer is completed at the moment of conversion, what we might call so-called instant sanctification. This, he believed, was to confuse justification and sanctification. Likewise, Lewis was unsympathetic to a doctrine of merit that limited divine agency as we find in late medieval Roman Catholic theology, or theology certainly before Vatican II Council in the 1960s. He also thought that this confuses justification and sanctification. So where in Lewis's ideas does sanctification take place? He alleged that for most believers, sanctification begins, but is not completed on earth, in this life. That is to say that we never reach Christian perfection or sainthood in this life. We die still corrupted by our sinful nature, however much improved it is since becoming a Christian. So, where is sanctification completed? Now, many, especially many Protestants, would answer that sanctification is completed either on earth or at the point of death. Lewis, however, raises the possibility, and he doesn't put this forward as a doctrine, but as a possibility, that sanctification, its completion, occurs in a state of purgatory. The most important components of Lewis's view of purgatory can be summarized as follows. First of all, the sufferings or disciplines of purgatory are the continuation of the process of sanctification that begins before death. Secondly, the sufferer voluntarily accepts these disciplines. And thirdly, the process is curative rather than retributive. That is, the emphasis is upon transformation, not on punishment. Like Samuel Johnson, the famous 18th century writer, and another grieving widower, Lewis believed that the closer one comes to the purity of heaven, the more he or she wishes for some preparation, some hollowing of the soul before it takes up its new citizenship. This, Lewis suggests, may occur in purgatory. In order to understand Lewis's views of purgatory more clearly, it might be helpful if we looked at what he denied about the doctrine. First of all, he denied that belief in purgatory encourages the acceptance of a doctrine of merit, as in the Roman Catholic tradition. As he wrote in his Letters to Malcolm, produced at the end of his life, I can well believe that people neither much worse nor much better than I will suffer less than I, or more. No nonsense about merit. The treatment given will be the one required, whether it hurts little or much. Lewis also denied that in purgatory the lost are to be given a second chance after death. He made this clear in The Problem of Pain, where he states that God would offer any number of second chances if they were likely to do any good. But he concludes that we would no more be inclined to accept God's offer later than earlier. Moreover, he argued, purgatory is not for the damned, but only for souls already saved. The point of his example of the refrigerum in the Great Divorce was not to argue that people are given a second chance, but that many people choose hell over heaven. Finally, Lewis denied belief in the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Roman Catholic teaching on the subject of purgatory could be summed up in this way. The Church teaches that those who have died in a state of wickedness go directly to hell. They also teach that those who are in a perfect state of grace and penitence go immediately to heaven. This represents a very small percentage of the population, however. Finally, those who through a state of grace are not yet spiritually perfect, those go to purgatory, where they are punished for their sins in direct relation to the nature and extent of their sinfulness. Now, it's generally accepted in Roman Catholic teaching that for the most part this process in purgatory takes a very long time. When their punishment is complete, they are then released to heaven. The Catholic Church bases its teaching on purgatory on both scripture and tradition. In the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, which is taken from the Apocrypha, which the Catholic Church incorporates into their official Bible, where Judas Maccabeus takes up a collection for a sin offering. He also prays for the dead. Thus, we are told, quote, he made atonement for the dead, that they might be delivered from their sin. Secondly, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 32, where Jesus says, quote, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. Roman Catholics believe that this implies that some sins, that is, sins other than speaking against the Holy Spirit, will be forgiven in the world to come, an interpretation upheld by Augustine and by some of the Church Fathers. And then finally in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15, where Paul writes, if any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. In terms of tradition, and as we've just heard, the doctrine of purgatory was upheld by various church fathers, such as Augustine, but also Gregory the Great and Thomas Aquinas, as well as by the Council of Florence in 1439 and the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563. Lewis suggested, however, that purgatory is not where believers are punished for sins committed on earth, but where believers are thoroughly prepared or transformed spiritually for entering heaven and for being in God's presence. Again, this process is curative rather than retributive. God makes use of our time in purgatory not to punish us, but to cure us, to purge from our souls any lingering inclinations towards sin, any tendencies to seek only the good of the self, and to turn from, quote, the taste for the other. Suffering and punishment, therefore, are not the purpose of purgatory. Purgatory is, therefore, where the process of sanctification is completed. It is a continuation of the cure which had already begun in this life, where a man or a woman puts on Christ and takes up his or her pilgrim's journey toward complete sanctification. As Lewis wrote in Letters to Malcolm, our souls demand purgatory, don't they? Would it not break the heart if God said to us, it is true, my son, that your breath smells and your rags drip with mud and slime. But we are charitable here, and no one will upbraid you with these things, nor draw away from you. Enter into joy. Should we not reply, with submission, sir, and if there is no objection, I'd rather be cleansed first? To which the reply came, it may hurt you, no. Even so, sir. To look at this from a more imaginative perspective, recall the example of Psyche in Till We Have Faces, where she is given a bath prior to her wedding feast. Or recall the example of Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Aslan, not Eustace, must tear off his dragon scales, and the process hurts. Purgatory, Lewis suggests, may thus be required for all but a very few saints, and required for the completion of the cure that has begun in this life, a process by which the imperfect person can be wholly sanctified and made ready for eternity in God's presence. Purgatory will not be a nice experience because, like sanctification itself, it will never be pleasant for us to abandon our self-will, our pride, our self-reliance, our independence, and our individual autonomy. What inspired Lewis's views of purgatory? Well, firstly, from Dante, especially Dante's portrayal of purgatory in the Divine Comedy. To Lewis, Dante represented the ideal of the high medieval age, given that he remained untouched by the corruption, theological and otherwise, that characterized much of his time. Secondly, from John Henry Newman. Newman was, of course, the great 19th century English theologian who influenced Lewis's thinking on the doctrine of purgatory through his well-known poem, The Dream of Gerontius, written in 1865. Here, Newman presents an ideal of the afterlife which describes purgatory as a place of purification, not of punishment. Now note, just as an aside, that Newman here presents this not as Roman Catholic dogma, which he would have gotten in great trouble for doing, but as a poem, which is a much safer way to raise and to express this rather different way of thinking about purgatory, a way that diverted from the Roman Catholic official teaching on the subject. So Newman had if you know much about Newman, you'll know he had a very good way of sort of skirting the censorship of the Roman Catholic Church. And he was very, very influential as a result of that and other things. But he kept out of trouble by writing poetry in this case, rather than writing something that was dogmatic. Now, having said all that, there's one more source of inspiration for Lewis's views of purgatory that we must consider. After the death of his wife, Lewis was compelled to reconsider the questions Christians have been asking about their deceased spouses, parents, children, friends, and loved ones for the past 2,000 years. Where is she now? Lewis must have wondered. What is her relationship to God at this very moment? Is she suffering? Consequently, his consideration of the doctrine of purgatory became more personally focused. In his work, A Grief Observed, for example, which we'll consider in a later class, Lewis wrote, and this is in regards to his recently deceased wife, "How do I know that all her anguish is past? I never believed before. I thought it immensely improbable that the most faithful soul could leap straight into perfection and peace the moment death has rattled in the throat. It would be wishful thinking with a vengeance to take up that belief now. Joy was a splendid thing, a soul straight, bright, and tempered like a sword, but not a perfect saint, a sinful woman married to a sinful man. Two of God's patients, not yet cured. I know there are not only tears to be dried, but stains to be scoured. The sword will be made even brighter." Lewis therefore had to consider whether Joy's cure continued. That is, would her process of sanctification not be complete until she had become, with an undivided heart, to rejoice in the fellowship of God. Not a few of Lewis's Catholic friends, including Tolkien, believed that Lewis would have to do hard time in purgatory for choosing to remain an Anglican, for marrying a divorcee, and so forth. Lewis had raised the possibility of purgatory numerous times, even though it was not an Anglican doctrine. And so it is a little ironic to see him thus condemned by his Catholic friends. As Lewis might have written, to go to purgatory after defending purgatory to those who did not believe in purgatory, that is, to his evangelical readers, and then, once you have arrived, to listen to lectures on purgatory by those who believe in a different form of purgatory, surely that would be hell, not purgatory. In conclusion, Lewis's view of purgatory may not have been meant to convince us of the existence of purgatory, but to persuade us both apologetically and imaginatively to acknowledge the central importance of sanctification in the Christian life. It can be argued that Lewis's position on purgatory limits the effects of Christ's atonement. Of course, there are various theories or views of Christ's atonement, but if one accepts the substitutionary theory of atonement, then I think it's probably true that Lewis's views of purgatory limits its effectiveness. After all, could we not rework the passage quoted earlier from Lewis's letters to Malcolm, involving a conversation between God and a new arrival in heaven along these lines? No doubt, at death, God would be perfectly justified in saying to us, quote, "It is true, my son, that your breath smells and your rags dip with mud and slime." And then, would he not also say to us, "But your sins are forgiven through Christ. You have been transformed into the likeness of Christ. Enter into joy." Lewis probably would not have occurred with this new wording. He seems to have believed that for a vast majority of people, more spiritual preparation is needed before we enter into God's presence. One of the questions remaining, however, is the extent to which his grieving over his wife, Joy Davidman, influenced his conception of purgatory, since most of what he wrote on this comes from the very last year or two of his life, that is, in the time in which he was grieving Joy's death. This remains a point of speculation, but it does lend to a great deal of thought and conversation about Lewis, and particularly about Lewis's emphasis upon sanctification, a point which I find Lewis scholars frequently overlook for reasons I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless doesn't get the treatment that it deserves within consideration of Lewis's theology.